Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about Ragnar Lodbrok. Settle in comfortably, take a deep breath, and let us journey together through the mists of time to explore the life of one of history's most fascinating figures. Ragnar Lodbrok, a name that echoes through the centuries, carrying with it the weight of legend, the power of myth, and perhaps, beneath it all, the footprints of a real man who walked the earth over 1,000 years ago. Our story begins not with certainty, but with mystery. The very existence of Ragnar Lodbrok remains one of history's beautiful enigmas, a puzzle where legend and reality intertwine so completely that separating one from the other becomes almost impossible. And perhaps that is fitting, for the Viking Age itself was a time when the boundaries between the mortal and the divine, between history and saga, were far more fluid than we might imagine today. To understand Ragnar Lodbrok, we must first understand the world that shaped him. Picture, if you will, the landscape of Scandinavia in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. This was a land of dramatic contrasts, of dark forests and bright fjords, of long winter nights and endless summer days, of harsh winters that tested human endurance and brief, intense summers that made the land bloom with sudden life. The people who inhabited this northern realm were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and traders, warriors and poets. They were a people shaped by their environment, hardened by necessity, and driven by a worldview that celebrated courage, honor, and the pursuit of fame that would outlast death itself. For the Norse peoples of this era, the concept of reputation, of one's name living on in the tales told around fires and in the halls of the mighty, was perhaps more important than life itself. The society into which Ragnar would have been born was complex and sophisticated, far more so than many later chronicles would suggest. The Vikings, despite their reputation as raiders and warriors, were also master shipbuilders, skilled navigators, and accomplished artists. Their craftsmanship in wood and metal was extraordinary. Their poetry was intricate and meaningful. Their legal systems, though different from those of the Christian kingdoms to the south, were detailed and functional. This was a world governed by the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and the rest of the Norse pantheon. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The gods were not distant, abstract beings, but active participants in the world, beings who could be bargained with, honored, and sometimes even tricked. Fate, or wired as the Norse called it, was a powerful force, but it was not entirely deterministic. A person's actions, their courage and cunning, could shape how fate unfolded. The political landscape of Scandinavia during this period was fragmented. There were no unified kingdoms as we would understand them today, but rather a patchwork of territories controlled by jarls and petty kings. Power was fluid, constantly contested, won through strength and cunning, and lost through weakness or misfortune. A successful warrior could rise from relatively modest beginnings to become a jarl, or even a king. Conversely, a king who showed weakness or who failed to distribute wealth to his followers could quickly find himself overthrown. It was into this world, dynamic, dangerous, and filled with possibility, that Ragnar Lodbrok was said to have been born. According to the Norse sagas, particularly the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons, our protagonist was born into a royal family. His father is traditionally identified as Sigurd Ring, a semi-legendary king of Sweden and Denmark. His mother is sometimes named as Alfhild, though the sources vary and are often contradictory. The name Lothbrok itself deserves our attention. It means hairy breeches or shaggy trousers, and according to legend, this unusual nickname came from a particular episode in Ragnar's youth. The story goes that Ragnar, seeking to win the hand of his first wife Thora, had to face a challenge set by her father. Thora's dwelling was guarded by a giant serpent, and none had been brave enough to face this creature. Ragnar, displaying the cunning that would become his hallmark, devised a solution. He had a pair of trousers made and boiled them in pitch and tar. These strange garments, when worn, protected him from the serpent's venom and bites. Thus clad, he was able to kill the beast and win Thora's hand. From that day forward, he was known as Ragnar Lodbrok, Ragnar of the Hairy Breeches. This story, like so many tales about Ragnar, operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it is an adventure tale, a story of a young hero overcoming a seemingly impossible challenge through cleverness and bravery. but it also tells us something about how the Norse valued intelligence as much as strength. Ragnar did not simply charge at the serpent with sword in hand. He thought, he planned, he prepared. This pattern would repeat throughout his legendary life. Thora Borgar Ragnar's first wife, according to the sagas, bore him 2 sons, Eirik and Agnar. The sagas describe her as a woman of great beauty and noble bearing, worthy of a hero's love. Their marriage, by all accounts in the legends, was a happy one. But happiness in the sagas is often fleeting, and Thora's life was cut short by illness. Ragnar was left a widower, his young sons motherless. The loss of Thora is described in the sagas with genuine emotion, a reminder that beneath the larger-than-life exploits, these stories were about human experiences that people of the time could relate to: love, loss, grief, and the necessity of continuing on despite sorrow. Time passed, as it must, and Ragnar's grief gradually transformed into something he could live with, rather than something that consumed him. His reputation as a warrior and leader continued to grow. His hall was a place of honor, where warriors gathered and oaths were sworn, where mead flowed and skalds sang of great deeds. It was during this period that Ragnar encountered the woman who would become his second wife, and the mother of his most famous sons, Aslaug, also known as Kraka. The story of how Ragnar met Aslaug is one of the most enchanting in the sagas, filled with disguise, revelation, and the working of fate. According to the tale, Ragnar's men encountered a woman of extraordinary beauty, but apparently humble birth. She called herself Kraka, and claimed to be a simple peasant girl, but there was something about her, a bearing, an intelligence, a quality that set her apart, that intrigued Ragnar's men, and they told their lord about her. Ragnar, curious, sent for her, but being a man who valued cleverness, he set her a challenge. She was to come to him neither clothed nor naked, neither hungry nor full, and neither alone nor in company. Many would have been stumped by such a riddle, but Aslaug proved equal to the task. She came to Ragnar wrapped in a fishing net, neither clothed nor naked, having taken a bite of an onion, neither hungry nor full, and accompanied by a dog, neither alone nor in company. Impressed by her wit, Ragnar proposed marriage, but Aslaug had her own conditions. She would marry him, she said, but warned him not to consummate the marriage for 3 nights, or else their first child would be born with a defect. Ragnar, perhaps overconfident in his restraint, or perhaps already so besotted that he agreed to anything, accepted her terms. But desire overcame patience, and Ragnar did not wait the 3 nights. When their first son was born, he bore the marks of his father's impatience. The child had the appearance of having no bones, or bones so soft they seemed absent. Thus he was named Ivar the Boneless, and despite his physical condition, he would grow to become one of the most formidable of Ragnar's sons. It was only after their marriage that Aslaug revealed her true identity. She was not Kraka the peasant, but Aslaug, the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. Her lineage was even more impressive than Ragnar's own, linking her to some of the greatest heroes of Norse legend. She had been raised in hiding after her parents' deaths, living in obscurity to protect herself from those who might seek to harm the child of such famous parents. This revelation must have been momentous for Ragnar. He had married a woman he believed to be a peasant, only to discover she was royalty of the highest order, descended from heroes and divine beings. It speaks to something admirable in Ragnar's character, at least as the sagas present him, that he was willing to marry someone he believed to be of humble birth, valuing her intelligence and spirit over noble lineage. Together, Ragnar and Aslaug would have several more sons, each of whom would become famous in their own right. After Ivar came Bjorn Ironside, so named for his seemingly impenetrable defense in battle. Then came Hvitserk, whose name means white shirt, and who would be known for his travels and adventures. Next was Ragnvald, and finally Sigurd Snake in the Eye, named for the mark in his eye that resembled a serpent biting its own tail, the symbol of eternity and the cycle of life and death. These sons of Ragnar and Aslaug would go on to lead armies, conquer kingdoms, and spread the influence of Norse culture across vast territories. But in the beginning, they were simply children, growing up in their father's hall, learning the skills they would need to survive and thrive in the Viking Age: how to handle weapons, how to navigate by the stars, how to command men, and how to think strategically. Ragnar's reputation was built on more than his noble birth or his extraordinary family. He was, above all else, a warrior and a leader of men. The sagas and chronicles that mention him consistently portray him as a formidable fighter, but also as a man who won battles through strategy and planning, as much as through martial prowess. In the Norse world, warfare was a fact of life. Conflicts between rival chieftains, raids for plunder and glory, battles over territory and resources. These were constant features of the landscape. A man who could not defend himself and his people, who could not lead warriors effectively, would not long maintain his position of power. Ragnar was said to excel in all aspects of warfare. In single combat, he was reportedly fearsome, wielding his weapons with deadly skill. But it was in leading larger forces that he truly shone. He understood the importance of morale, of inspiring his men to follow him, even into desperate situations. He grasped the tactical importance of terrain, of timing, of surprise. He was willing to take risks, but they were calculated risks, not the reckless actions of a berserker lost in battle fury. The sagas tell of numerous raids and battles led by Ragnar. Some of these may be historical, others purely legendary, and many probably a mixture of both. What matters for understanding Ragnar's character is not necessarily whether each specific event occurred, but what these stories tell us about the qualities he was believed to embody. One recurring theme in the tales of Ragnar's military exploits is his willingness to strike where his enemies least expected. While other raiders might target coastal villages and monasteries, the traditional targets of Viking raids, Ragnar thought bigger. He understood that true wealth and lasting fame came not from small raids, but from great victories. His raids took him far from Scandinavian shores. The sagas speak of expeditions to the Baltic, to the lands of the Franks, to England and beyond. Each journey was a test of seamanship and navigation, for the open sea was treacherous, and many who ventured forth did not return. The ships that carried Ragnar and his warriors were marvels of engineering. The Norse longships were shallow-drafted vessels that could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers, making them incredibly versatile. They could be rowed when the wind failed and sailed when conditions were favorable. Their design allowed for rapid beach landings, meaning raiders could strike quickly and retreat before defenders could organize a response. But the ships were more than just practical tools. They were things of beauty. Carved prows, often in the shape of dragons or serpents, were designed to strike fear into enemies and, perhaps, to appease or ward off the spirits of the sea. The ships were given names and treated almost as living things. A good ship was a warrior's prized possession, and ship burials for important individuals show how central these vessels were to Norse culture. Ragnar was said to have commanded fleets of these ships, and the sight of multiple longships appearing on the horizon must have been terrifying for coastal settlements. The Vikings struck quickly, with overwhelming force, and were gone before organized resistance could arrive. Of all Ragnar's exploits, none is more famous than the raid on Paris in 845 CE. This event is documented in Frankish chronicles as well as Norse sources, giving it a stronger claim to historicity than many other episodes in Ragnar's life. Though the Frankish sources do not name the leader of the Viking force, many historians believe it may indeed have been Ragnar Lodbrok, or a historical figure upon whom the legend of Ragnar was based. Picture the scene: the city of Paris, seat of Frankish power, standing on the Seine River. The river itself was both Paris's lifeline and its vulnerability, providing trade and transportation, but also offering an avenue of approach for attackers. The Franks had dealt with Viking raids before, but nothing on the scale of what was about to unfold. In March of 845, a fleet of Viking ships appeared on the Seine. The sources vary on the exact number. Some say 120 ships, which if accurate would mean a force of several thousand warriors. The fleet sailed upriver toward Paris, and the Franks hastily assembled an army to defend their city. King Charles the Bald, ruler of West Francia, divided his forces to defend both banks of the river. This decision, meant to prevent the Vikings from bypassing the Frankish army, would prove to be a fatal mistake. Ragnar, if indeed he was the commander of this expedition, saw the opportunity immediately. Rather than engaging both Frankish forces simultaneously, Ragnar concentrated his entire strength against the weaker of the two armies. The battle was fierce but relatively brief. The Vikings overwhelmed the Frankish force, killing or capturing many warriors. But what Ragnar did next demonstrated a cruelty that was calculated to have maximum psychological impact. He hanged 111 Frankish prisoners in sight of the army on the opposite bank of the river. This act served multiple purposes. It was a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death, meant to ensure victory. It was a demonstration of Viking strength and ruthlessness, and it was a calculated move to demoralize the remaining Frankish forces. The tactic worked. The army on the other bank of the Seine, already shaken by witnessing the defeat of their comrades, dissolved. Some fled, others deserted, and the path to Paris lay open. The Vikings entered Paris on Easter Sunday, March 28, 845. The timing was surely deliberate. To attack on one of Christianity's holiest days was to make a statement about the power of the old gods over the new religion. The inhabitants of Paris, unable to mount an effective defense, watched in horror as the Norsemen poured into their city. What followed was the sack of Paris. Churches and monasteries, filled with treasures, were prime targets. The Vikings were not interested in conversion or in respecting Christian religious sensibilities. They saw the wealth of the church as plunder like any other, and perhaps even more desirable because it was concentrated in relatively few locations. But Ragnar was not simply interested in looting and leaving. He understood the potential for a much greater prize. He sent word to King Charles, pay a ransom, and the Vikings would leave the city intact. Refuse, and Paris would be burned to the ground. Charles, facing the destruction of his capital and lacking the military means to drive out the invaders, agreed. The ransom was set at 7,000 pounds of silver, an enormous sum, equivalent to several years' worth of royal revenue. Charles had to raise taxes, melt down church treasures, and demand contributions from nobles to assemble the payment. Ragnar, having secured this immense fortune, kept his word and withdrew from Paris. He had achieved a stunning success, entering one of the major cities of Western Europe, defeating the Frankish army, and extracting an enormous ransom without losing his fleet or suffering significant casualties. It was a masterpiece of Viking raiding strategy. The raid on Paris had far-reaching consequences. For the Franks, it demonstrated their vulnerability to Viking attacks. Charles the Bald earned the nickname Charles the Fat in some sources, though whether this referred to physical appearance or was a derogatory comment on his handling of the crisis is unclear. The payment of Danegeld, as such ransoms came to be known, set a dangerous precedent. It showed that the Franks could be made to pay, and payment only encouraged more raids. For Ragnar, if he was indeed the leader of this expedition, the Paris raid represented the apex of his career. The wealth he brought back to Scandinavia would have made him one of the richest men in the Norse world. His fame spread far and wide. Skalds composed poems about the achievement. His name became synonymous with bold enterprise and cunning strategy. But there is an Old Norse proverb, "The one who rises highest falls farthest." Ragnar's very success may have sown the seeds of his eventual downfall. To understand Ragnar's later years, we must delve deeper into the complex web of relationships that surrounded him. For no man, no matter how great, exists in isolation. Ragnar's life was shaped by his connections to others, his wives, his sons, his rivals, and his allies. His relationship with Aslaug appears to have been one of genuine partnership, at least initially. She was not merely a wife, but an advisor, someone whose counsel Ragnar valued. The sagas portray her as intelligent and occasionally gifted with prophetic knowledge, a seeress who could glimpse the patterns of fate. Whether this reflected historical reality or was an embellishment added to enhance the legendary quality of the saga, it speaks to the respect accorded to women in Norse society, at least in some contexts. Yet the sagas also hint at tensions in the marriage, as would be expected in any long-term relationship, especially one involving two strong-willed individuals. There are suggestions that Ragnar occasionally chafed at Aslaug's advice, that his pride sometimes led him to disregard her warnings. These human touches, the conflicts and compromises of married life, make the saga more relatable, reminding us that even heroes must navigate the complexities of domestic relationships. Ragnar's relationship with his sons was central to his life and legacy. In Norse culture, A man's sons were his future. They would carry on his name, inherit his wealth and position, and be responsible for avenging any wrongs done to him. The quality of one's sons reflected on the father, and Ragnar had reason to be proud. Ivar the Boneless, despite his physical limitations, proved to be perhaps the most cunning and ambitious of Ragnar's sons. Unable to fight in the conventional manner, Ivar developed his mind instead, becoming a master strategist. The sagas describe him as being carried into battle on a shield, directing troops with brilliant tactical insight. His very limitations forced him to think creatively, to find ways to achieve victory that did not rely on personal martial prowess. Bjorn Ironside became a legendary warrior in his own right, known for his near invulnerability in battle. Stories tell of enemy weapons bouncing off him as if he were made of iron, giving him his byname. He was said to have led expeditions to the Mediterranean, raiding as far as the coasts of North Africa and Italy, journeys that demonstrated the remarkable range of Viking maritime capabilities. Hvitserk became known for his travels and adventures, appearing in various chronicles and sagas across different time periods and locations, leading some historians to suggest that Hvitserk may have been a title or name applied to multiple individuals, or that the historical figure's exploits were conflated with those of others. Sigurd's snake in the eye, with his distinctive marking, was said to be particularly beloved by his father. The snake swallowing its tail in his eye was seen as a sign of his destiny, marking him as someone who would play an important role in the great cycles of history. Ragnar's sons from his first marriage, Eric and Agnar, are less prominent in the sagas than the sons of Aslaug, which may reflect historical reality. Perhaps they died young, or were less successful, or may be the result of the saga's focus on the more dramatic narratives surrounding the later sons. The relationships among the brothers themselves were complex. There was rivalry, certainly, each son seeking to prove himself worthy of their father's legacy, each wanting to be remembered as a great warrior and leader in his own right. But there was also cooperation and brotherhood. When their father's fate hung in the balance, they would come together, setting aside their differences for a common purpose. As Ragnar aged, the sagas tell us, he became restless. This restlessness was a common theme in Norse literature. The idea that a true warrior could never be content with peace, that the desire for fame and glory would drive men to seek out danger even when they had already achieved great success. Some versions of the saga suggest that Ragnar felt overshadowed by his sons' growing reputations. They were leading their own expeditions, winning their own victories, and their fame was beginning to rival his own. For a man whose entire identity was bound up in his reputation as a warrior and leader, this must have been difficult to accept. There are also suggestions that Ragnar and Islaug's relationship had cooled over the years. Some versions of the saga introduce Lagertha, described as a shield maiden and Ragnar's first wife in some tellings, though the chronology is confused and contradictory. Lagertha is portrayed as a formidable warrior in her own right, someone who fought alongside Ragnar and earned his respect before they eventually parted ways. The figure of Lagertha is fascinating and problematic for historians. She appears in the writings of Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing in the late 12th century. But her historicity is uncertain. She may represent a conflation of several different women, or she may be largely fictional, or she may be based on a real person whose story was heavily embellished over the centuries. Regardless, her presence in the saga tradition speaks to the complex attitudes toward women warriors in Norse culture, simultaneously celebrated in stories and myths, while probably being quite rare in historical reality. Whether driven by a desire to reclaim his glory, to escape domestic tensions, or simply by the wandering spirit that defined Viking culture, Ragnar began planning one more great expedition. This would not be a raid aimed at plunder or a battle for territory. This would be something more ambitious, more dangerous, and ultimately more fateful. England in the mid-9th century was not a unified kingdom, but a collection of rival realms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex being the primary powers. These kingdoms had been dealing with Viking raids for decades, and while they had not found a permanent solution to the problem, they had become more organized in their defense. King Aella of Northumbria was one of the Anglo-Saxon rulers who had proven capable of standing against the Vikings. His kingdom, centered on York, which the Vikings knew as Jorvik, was wealthy and powerful. It was also, according to the sagas, where Ragnar chose to direct his final expedition. The reasons for this choice are debated. Some versions of the saga suggest that Ragnar was deliberately courting danger, that he wanted to prove he could still achieve great things despite his age. Others suggest he had been insulted by Ella in some way and sought revenge. Still others propose that he simply saw Northumbria as a target rich enough to be worth the risk. Whatever his motivation, Ragnar assembled a fleet, though accounts vary on its size, with some sources suggesting he took only 2 ships, a surprisingly small force if accurate. This has led some historians to speculate that perhaps Ragnar's expedition was more of a reconnaissance mission that went wrong, or that his forces were diminished by storms, or that the sources are simply unreliable on this point. The journey across the North Sea was treacherous even in the best of conditions. The Vikings were skilled sailors, but the sea was a dangerous adversary. Storms could rise with little warning, separating ships from their fleet, driving them off course, or sending them to the bottom. Navigation relied on observing the sun, stars, and birds, on understanding the patterns of waves and currents, and on experience and intuition. According to the saga, Ragnar's fleet was indeed struck by storms. Ships were damaged or lost. By the time Ragnar reached the coast of Northumbria, his force was much diminished. Whether this was the result of natural misfortune, or whether there were other factors at play, poor planning, insufficient preparation, or simply bad luck, the result was the same. Ragnar landed in England without the overwhelming force that had always been his advantage in previous campaigns. Despite this setback, Ragnar proceeded with his raid. Perhaps he hoped to strike quickly, seize enough plunder to make the voyage worthwhile, and escape before the Northumbrians could mount an effective response. Perhaps he underestimated King Aella's capabilities. Perhaps, as some versions of the saga suggest, fate had already determined that this would be Ragnar's last adventure, and all his skill and experience could not alter that wired. King Aella, learning of the Viking landing, moved quickly. He assembled his forces, perhaps including warriors from neighboring kingdoms, who were equally eager to strike a blow against the Norse raiders, and marched to intercept Ragnar. The battle that followed was fierce but ultimately one-sided. Ragnar's reduced forces, perhaps a few hundred men at most, faced a much larger Anglo-Saxon army. The Vikings fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they had no line of retreat, but courage alone could not overcome such odds. Ragnar was captured. The great Viking leader, who had defied kings and sacked cities, who had amassed fortunes and fathered legendary sons, was now a prisoner of King Aella. What happened next has become one of the most famous episodes in the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, a scene that has captured imaginations for over 1,000 years and cemented Ragnar's place in legend. King Aella, having captured the notorious Viking raider, faced a decision about what to do with his prisoner. Execution was the obvious choice, but Aella wanted more than simply to end Ragnar's life. He wanted to send a message to any other Vikings who might consider raiding Northumbria. He wanted to demonstrate that even the mightiest Norse warrior could be brought low. The method of execution Aella chose was both creative and horrific. Ragnar would be thrown into a pit filled with venomous serpents. This form of execution appears in various medieval sources, though how common it actually was is uncertain. Symbolically, it was rich with meaning. Serpents were associated with treachery and poison, with lingering death rather than the clean end of a sword stroke. For a warrior culture that valued dying in battle, this was a deliberately humiliating fate. The saga describes Ragnar's final hours in vivid detail. He was given one last chance to renounce his gods, to accept Christian baptism, and thus to earn an easier death. Ragnar refused. He would die as he had lived, faithful to Odin and Thor and the old ways. As he was lowered into the pit, the serpents began to strike. The venom burned through his body. But according to the saga, Ragnar faced his death with extraordinary composure. He did not beg for mercy or cry out in pain beyond what any man might involuntarily. Instead, he recited what has become known as the Death Song of Ragnar Lodbrok, a poem that encapsulated his life, his achievements, and his defiant spirit. The poem is a fascinating document in its own right. It cycles through Ragnar's battles and victories, each stanza beginning with the phrase, "We struck with our swords," or variations thereof. It speaks of battles in various lands, of opponents defeated, of wealth won and glory earned. It is simultaneously a boast, a final declaration of all that Ragnar had accomplished, and a meditation on the nature of fame and death. The climax of the death song is its final stanza, where Ragnar, feeling death approaching, declares his confidence that he will soon feast in the halls of Odin, that the Valkyries will welcome him to Valhalla. He laughs at his own death, declaring that he goes gladly to the next world. And then, in what has become perhaps the most famous line attributed to Ragnar, he speaks of his sons. How the young pigs would grunt if they knew the suffering of the old boar. This line is both a declaration of paternal pride, Ragnar knows his sons are worthy successors, and a warning to King Aelle. The young pigs are Ragnar's sons, and the grunting they will do is the sound of their fury when they learn of their father's death. Ragnar, even in his final moments, is promising that vengeance will come. With that, according to the saga, Ragnar Lodbrok died in the pit of serpents, and his legend was complete. Before we continue with the saga's account of what happened after Ragnar's death, it is worth pausing to consider the historical questions surrounding his existence. The story of Ragnar Lodbrok presents historians with a fascinating puzzle, one that illustrates the challenges of studying the Viking Age and the nature of how history becomes legend. The primary sources for Ragnar's life are the Norse sagas, particularly the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, which was written down in Iceland in the 13th century. This means it was composed some 400 years after the events it describes. During those centuries, the stories of Ragnar would have been passed down orally, told and retold by skalds and storytellers, evolving and changing with each telling. Elements from different people's lives may have been combined into a single legendary figure. Purely fictional episodes may have been added to make the stories more dramatic or to illustrate particular virtues or lessons. The Frankish chronicles do mention a Viking raid on Paris in 845, and they mention that a massive ransom was paid. However, they do not name the leader of the Viking force. Some chronicles refer to him only as a certain Ragnar, or use other vague phrases. This could be a reference to Ragnar Lodbrok, but it could also be a reference to another person named Ragnar, a common Norse name. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other English sources mention numerous Viking raids and invasions during the 9th century, but specific references that can be definitively connected to Ragnar are lacking. King Aelle of Northumbria was a real historical figure who did reign during the period when Ragnar supposedly invaded, and he was indeed killed by a Viking army, but the sources do not clearly indicate that this Viking army was led by Ragnar's sons seeking vengeance. Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing hints, but no definitive proof. Viking Age graves, including some spectacular ship burials, have been found throughout Scandinavia. Some contain artifacts and inscriptions that suggest the deceased was a person of high status, perhaps even a king or great jarl. Could any of these be Ragnar? Possibly, but there is no way to know for certain. Unlike in some cultures where tomb inscriptions name the deceased, Viking burial practices typically did not include detailed written records. In recent years, DNA analysis of remains from Viking Age burials has opened new avenues of research. By comparing DNA from different burials, researchers can establish family relationships and trace lineages. It is theoretically possible that DNA evidence could someday help confirm or refute whether certain individuals were related in the ways the sagas claim. However, this research is still in its early stages, and linking specific remains to saga characters is extremely difficult. The question, was Ragnar Lodbrok real, may be the wrong question to ask. A better question might be, what is the relationship between the legendary Ragnar and historical reality? The answer appears to be complex. Ragnar, as described in the sagas, is almost certainly not a historical figure in the sense of someone whose life played out exactly as the stories describe. The Ragnar of the sagas is too perfect, too legendary, performs too many remarkable deeds, and lives in too many places over too long, a period for the stories to be straightforward historical accounts. However, the sagas likely contain a core of historical truth. There probably was a powerful Norse leader, or leaders in the 9th century, who conducted successful raids on Francia and possibly on England. This person or persons became famous, and stories about their exploits were told and retold, Over time, these stories attracted other legendary elements, absorbed episodes from other people's lives, and evolved into the saga cycle we have today. In this sense, asking whether Ragnar Lothbrok was real is like asking whether King Arthur was real. There may have been a historical person or persons who inspired the legends, but the legendary figure is a creation of many hands over many years, a composite of history, myth, and imagination. For our purposes, what matters most is not whether every detail of the saga is historically accurate, but what the saga tells us about Viking Age culture and values. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was composed by people who lived in a culture that still remembered the Viking Age, and the saga reflects the ideals, beliefs, and worldview of that culture. Ragnar, whether he walked the earth exactly as described or not, represents the ideal Viking hero, brave, cunning, loyal to his gods, generous to his followers, and eager for fame that would outlast death. The saga does not end with Ragnar's death. In fact, in many ways, his death is just the beginning of the most historically significant part of the story. For while Ragnar's existence is uncertain, the existence and actions of his supposed sons, particularly Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, are much better documented in historical sources. When news of Ragnar's death reached Scandinavia, his sons reacted exactly as their father had predicted. Their grief transformed into rage, their rage into determination for revenge. They began assembling a force unlike any that had been seen before in the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that, in 865, a great army of Vikings arrived in East Anglia. The chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, and unlike the typical Viking raids that struck quickly and then withdrew, this force had come to stay. It was led by men the sources identify as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, sometimes identified with Hvitserk, and Ubba, possibly another son or brother of Ragnar, though the sources are unclear. The size of this army has been debated by historians. The Anglo-Saxon sources, which naturally wanted to emphasize the magnitude of the threat they faced, suggest it numbered in the thousands. Modern historians generally estimate the force at somewhere between 500 and 1,000 warriors. Small by modern standards, but enormous by Viking Age standards, and far larger than typical raiding parties. What made this army particularly formidable was not just its size, but its organization and unity of purpose. Unlike previous Viking raids, which often consisted of independent warbands pursuing their own goals, the Great Heathen Army was a coordinated force with clear leadership and strategic objectives. The initial target was Northumbria, King Aella's kingdom, the place where Ragnar had met his death. The sons of Ragnar had not forgotten their father's final words, and they had come to make those words prophetic. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, where they overwintered, gathering supplies and horses. The king of East Anglia, Edmund, made peace with them, providing horses and supplies in exchange for their promise to leave his kingdom alone. It was a wise move on Edmund's part, though ultimately only a temporary reprieve, as later events would show. In 866, the Viking army moved north into Northumbria. The timing was fortunate for the invaders, as Northumbria was divided by civil conflict. Two rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Aella, were fighting for control of the kingdom. This division made Northumbria vulnerable, as the rivals were more focused on each other than on the external threat. The Vikings seized York, the capital of Northumbria, with relative ease. The city was wealthy and strategically important, controlling routes into northern England and Scotland. Its capture was a stunning blow to Northumbrian power. The fall of York forced Osbert and Aella to put aside their differences and unite against the common enemy. They assembled their forces and marched on York, determined to retake their capital. The battle that followed, fought in the city's streets and on its walls, was fierce and bloody. According to the sources, both Osbert and Aella were killed in the fighting. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records their deaths matter-of-factly, without giving details. The saga tradition, however, provides much more vivid and disturbing detail about the death of Aella. According to these accounts, Aella was captured alive during the battle. The sons of Ragnar, particularly Ivar the Boneless, had been waiting for this moment. They now had in their power the man who had killed their father, and they intended to make his death memorable. The saga describes the execution method as the blood eagle, one of the most notorious and controversial elements of the Ragnar saga cycle. According to these accounts, Ella was placed face down, and his ribs were cut from his spine and bent backwards to resemble the wings of an eagle. His lungs were then pulled out through the wounds, creating a horrific image meant to evoke a bird with spread wings. The historicity of the blood eagle is hotly debated. No contemporaneous sources describe it, and the first references appear in saga literature, written down centuries after the Viking Age. Some historians argue that it is a misinterpretation of poetic language, that when sagas speak of cutting the blood eagle, they are using a metaphor for killing someone in battle, not describing a literal execution method. Others believe it may have been a rare ritual punishment reserved for special cases, perhaps performed once or twice, and then embellished in later retellings. Still others think it is entirely fictional, a gruesome detail added by saga writers to make their stories more dramatic. Whether the blood eagle was real or not, what is clear is that King Aella died during or shortly after the battle for York, and that his death marked the completion of Ragnar's sons' revenge for their father. Northumbria, which had been a powerful kingdom, never fully recovered from this blow. York would remain under Viking control for the next century, becoming a major Scandinavian city in the British Isles. But the great heathen army did not disband after achieving its initial objective. Having tasted victory and seen the wealth of England, its leaders decided to continue their campaign of conquest. Over the next several years, the great heathen army moved across England, conquering kingdoms and reshaping the political landscape of the British Isles. This period marked a fundamental transformation in English history, one whose effects are still visible today. After taking Northumbria, the army moved south into Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom. In 867 and 868, they conducted campaigns that devastated Mercian power. Nottingham was captured, and King Burgred of Mercia was forced to make peace and pay tribute. In 869, the army turned east to East Anglia, the kingdom that had initially supplied them with horses and supplies. The aging King Edmund attempted to defend his realm, but his forces were overwhelmed. Edmund himself was captured and, according to tradition, offered the chance to renounce Christianity and submit to the Vikings. When he refused, he was executed. Some sources say he was tied to a tree and shot with arrows, making him a Christian martyr. The Church of St. Edmund grew up around his cult, and he became one of England's most important saints. The story of his martyrdom, true or embellished, served as a rallying point for English resistance to the Vikings, and became a powerful piece of propaganda for Christian authorities seeking to frame the conflict in religious terms. By 870, the great heathen army controlled most of northern and eastern England. The only major Anglo-Saxon kingdom that remained independent was Wessex, ruled by King Ethelred and his younger brother, Alfred. The Vikings invaded Wessex in late 870, and what followed was a series of battles that would determine the future of England. The West Saxon forces, though outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. They won some victories and suffered some defeats, in a grinding campaign where neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Then, in 871, King Ethelred died. Whether from wounds received in battle or from illness, the sources do not clearly indicate. His brother Alfred succeeded him at one of the darkest moments in West Saxon history. The kingdom seemed on the verge of collapse, its armies exhausted, its treasury depleted from paying tribute, and the Viking forces still threatening to overrun the remaining independent territory. Alfred, who would later earn the epithet the Great, the only English monarch to be so honored, proved to be a worthy adversary. In a series of battles and negotiations, he managed to stabilize the military situation. When neither side could overcome the other, Alfred and the Viking leaders negotiated a peace treaty. The Vikings withdrew from Wessex, though they retained control of the territories they had already conquered. This peace was temporary, and fighting would resume in later years. But Alfred used the breathing space wisely, reorganizing his military, building fortifications, and creating a system of burhs, fortified towns, that would make future Viking invasions much more difficult. The settlement that eventually emerged divided England between the Danelaw, territories under Viking control, where Scandinavian law and customs prevailed, and the West Saxon kingdom, which remained Anglo-Saxon. This division would shape English history for generations, influencing everything from language to law to culture. Words we use in modern English today, terms like law itself, sky, window, knife, egg, and hundreds of others entered the language during this period of Danish settlement. Place names across northern and eastern England still bear witness to Scandinavian influence, with endings like -by, -thorpe, and -thwaite marking areas of Viking settlement. While the great heathen army was conquering England under Ivar's leadership, other sons of Ragnar were pursuing their own paths to glory. Bjorn Ironside, in particular, embarked on one of the most ambitious Viking expeditions ever attempted, a raid into the Mediterranean. Around 859, according to various sources, Bjorn assembled a fleet and sailed south from Scandinavia. His route took him past the coast of France and Spain, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean Sea, waters that few, if any, Norse warriors had navigated before. The expedition raided along the coasts of Spain and North Africa, attacking coastal settlements and capturing slaves and treasure. The appearance of Viking longships in the Mediterranean must have been shocking to the people of the region, who had no experience with these northern raiders and whose defenses were oriented toward different threats. Bjorn's fleet reportedly sailed as far as Italy, raiding along the coast and even attacking Rome, or at least this is what later sources claim. The historical reality is more complicated. Bjorn's fleet did raid in Italy, but they attacked a city called Luna, apparently believing it was Rome. When they arrived and saw the city's white marble buildings gleaming in the sun, they assumed they had found the eternal city itself. The saga tells an amusing story about how Bjorn took Luna. Unable to breach the city's walls by force, he resorted to trickery. He sent messengers to the city claiming that the Viking leader had died, and that his dying wish was to be buried in a Christian church. The messengers asked permission to bring Bjorn's body into the city for proper burial. The citizens of Luna, perhaps feeling safe behind their walls and moved by the appeal to Christian charity, agreed. A solemn funeral procession entered the city, carrying a coffin supposedly containing Bjorn's body. Once inside the walls, however, Bjorn leaped from the coffin, and the mourners revealed themselves as warriors. They opened the city gates, allowing the rest of the Viking force to enter, and Luna was sacked. This story, whether entirely accurate or not, reveals something important about how the Vikings were perceived and how they perceived themselves. Cunning was valued as much as strength, and a clever stratagem that won victory without heavy casualties was worth celebrating and remembering. The Mediterranean expedition faced numerous challenges. The heat of the southern climate was oppressive for men accustomed to northern cold. The diseases of the Mediterranean region were different from those in Scandinavia, and the Vikings had no immunity to them. Many men fell ill, and some ships were lost. Eventually, Bjorn decided it was time to return home. The fleet headed back north, though only a fraction of the ships that had started the journey made it back to Scandinavia. But those ships that did return were laden with treasure, gold and silver, jewels and fine cloth, slaves and exotic goods that would have seemed almost miraculous to people in the north. Bjorn's reputation was enhanced enormously by this expedition. He had gone where no Norse warrior had gone before, had brought back wealth from the fabled south, and had proven his worth as a leader and warrior independent of his father's fame. His name became legendary, and he established himself as a powerful jarl in his own right. Of all Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless is perhaps the most fascinating and the most mysterious. The very nature of his condition, what boneless actually meant, has been debated for centuries. The traditional interpretation is that Ivar suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, a genetic disorder that causes brittle bones and can result in skeletal deformities. This would explain why the saga describes him as being unable to walk normally and needing to be carried into battle. However, it raises questions about how someone with this condition could have been an effective military leader. Alternative theories suggest that boneless was a mistranslation or misunderstanding of a nickname that meant something else, perhaps hated by his bones, meaning his enemies, or referring to his flexibility and agility, or even to his extraordinary height, making him seem snake-like. Some historians have suggested it might refer to impotence or to a cunning that allowed him to bend like someone without the rigid structure of bones. Whatever the physical reality of his condition, the sagas and chronicles agree on certain points about Ivar's character. He was intelligent, calculating, and ruthless. Where other leaders might rely primarily on strength and courage, Ivar excelled at strategy and psychological warfare. He understood that winning battles was as much about breaking enemy morale and creating division as it was about the actual fighting. Ivar was also portrayed as particularly devoted to the Old Norse gods, especially to Odin. Odin was the god of wisdom and cunning, of poetry and war, of sacrifices and death. Ivar's approach to leadership, emphasizing intelligence and strategy, using psychological tactics, and being willing to employ cunning and deception, aligned well with these aspects of Odin's character. The chronicles suggest that Ivar was the primary strategist behind the great heathen army's successes. While other leaders might command in individual battles, Ivar conceived the overall strategy, identifying targets, arranging alliances, and managing logistics. His ability to keep the great heathen army unified and focused on its objectives, rather than fragmenting into separate raiding parties as previous Viking forces had done, was crucial to its success. Ivar's death is recorded in the Irish Annals, which state that he died in 873 in Dublin, where he had become a major power. The Annals describe him as King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, a title that, even allowing for exaggeration, indicates the enormous power and influence he had accumulated. Some sources suggest that Ivar requested to be buried at a strategic location where his mere presence, even in death, would protect against invasion. According to these accounts, as long as his grave remained undisturbed, no enemy could successfully invade. Later, when William the Conqueror invaded England, he supposedly had to find and dig up Ivar's bones before his invasion could succeed. Though this story is certainly legendary, it speaks to Ivar's reputation even centuries after his death. While the sons of Ragnar were conquering kingdoms and building legends in England and beyond, developments in Scandinavia itself were equally significant. The Viking Age was a period of profound change in the northern lands, and the activities of warriors like Ragnar and his sons were both a symptom and a cause of these changes. The Viking expansion was driven by multiple factors. Population growth in Scandinavia may have created pressure on available farmland. Improvements in shipbuilding technology made long-distance voyaging more feasible. Political consolidation, the slow emergence of more powerful kingdoms, may have displaced some jarls and warriors who sought new opportunities abroad. Climate change, with a medieval warm period making northern latitudes more habitable, may have played a role. The wealth of Western European monasteries and towns offered tempting targets. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the result was that Scandinavian warriors, traders, and settlers spread across vast distances. Vikings established settlements in Iceland and Greenland, reached North America centuries before Columbus, founded kingdoms in Ireland and Scotland, ruled territories in England, established the Duchy of Normandy in France, served as elite guards for the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, and traded along the river routes of Eastern Europe all the way to the Caspian Sea and Baghdad. This expansion had profound effects on Scandinavia itself. Wealth flowed back to the northern lands, silver from England, gold from Francia, exotic goods from the Mediterranean and the East. This influx of wealth accelerated social and political change. Chieftains who controlled trade routes or who successfully led raids became immensely powerful. They could afford to maintain larger bands of warriors, build impressive halls, and display their status through conspicuous consumption and generosity. The political landscape gradually consolidated. Petty kingdoms were absorbed into larger realms. Harald Fairhair united much of Norway under his rule in the late 9th century. Denmark coalesced into a more unified kingdom. Sweden underwent a similar process of consolidation. These emerging kingdoms would become the nations we know today, though the process would take centuries to complete. Religion also began to change during this period, though the transformation was gradual. The first Christian missionaries arrived in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, and while conversion was slow and often superficial at first, by the end of the Viking Age, generally dated to around 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Scandinavia was nominally Christian. This religious transformation had enormous consequences. Christianity brought with it literacy, as Latin learning spread from the monasteries. It connected Scandinavia more firmly to the broader European world. It also meant the end of practices like human sacrifice and burial with grave goods that had been part of Norse tradition, though it would be a mistake to see conversion as a simple replacement of one religion with another. For generations, many people continued to honor the old gods alongside the new, and elements of Norse paganism persisted in folk traditions and beliefs long after official conversion. The sagas themselves, including the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, were products of this transitional period. They were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, when Iceland was Christian but still remembered its pagan past. The saga writers were working in a Christian tradition, using alphabetic literacy, but writing about pagan heroes and gods. This created an interesting tension. The sagas clearly admire the courage and larger-than-life qualities of their heroes, but they also sometimes seem to judge them, or their world, as tragic or flawed when viewed from a Christian perspective. To truly understand Ragnar Lodbrok and the world he represents, we need to explore the Norse worldview more deeply. The way the Vikings understood the cosmos, the divine, and their place in the grand scheme of things was fundamentally different from modern perspectives, and it shaped everything about how they lived and what they valued. The Norse cosmos was organized into 9 worlds, all supported by, or connected to, Yggdrasil, the world tree. This immense ash tree was imagined as the axis of existence, with its branches reaching into the heavens and its roots delving into the depths. The 9 worlds included Asgard, home of the Aesir gods like Odin and Thor; Midgard, the world of humans; Jotunheim, land of the giants; Alfheim, realm of the elves, and several others. These worlds were not necessarily different planets, but different realms of existence connected by bridges and pathways that gods and heroes could traverse. At the center of Midgard, according to some traditions, was Midgard's serpent, Jormungandr, a creature so vast that it encircled the entire world and held its tail in its mouth, a symbol of the cyclical nature of existence. The serpent was one of the children of Loki, the trickster god, and it was prophesied to play a key role in Ragnarok, the end of the world. Speaking of Ragnarok, this concept was central to Norse mythology and worldview. Unlike in many religions where the gods are eternal and unchanging, the Norse believed that the gods themselves would eventually die. Ragnarok, the fate of the gods or twilight of the gods, was a cataclysmic event when the forces of chaos and destruction would rise up against the gods and the world as it existed. The prophecies of Ragnarok are detailed in the Poetic Edda, particularly in a poem called Voluspa. They describe a terrible winter lasting 3 years, brothers fighting brothers, the breaking of all bonds and oaths. Then the monsters and giants would attack. The wolf Fenrir would break free from his chains, Jormungandr would rise from the ocean, and Surtur the fire giant would lead forth the forces of Muspelheim. The gods would fight valiantly, but most would die. Odin would be devoured by Fenrir. Thor would kill Jormungandr, but die from the serpent's venom. The world itself would burn and then sink into the sea. Yet, Ragnarok was not the absolute end. After the destruction, the prophecy continued. The world would rise again from the waters, green and fertile. Some gods would survive or be reborn. A new human couple would emerge to repopulate the world. It was a cycle of destruction and renewal, death and rebirth. This worldview had profound implications for how the Norse understood life. If even the gods were fated to die, then human mortality was not something to be feared or denied, but simply a fact of existence. What mattered was not living forever, that was impossible, but living in such a way that one's name and deeds would be remembered. Fame was a kind of immortality, the only immortality truly available. This is why courage was so highly valued in Viking culture. A person who faced danger without flinching, who accepted death when it came without complaint, who fought fiercely even in a hopeless situation. Such a person was earning lasting renown. Conversely, a person who died safely in bed of old age might live a long life, but would not be remembered in the same way as someone who died heroically. The Norse afterlife reflected these values. Warriors who died in battle might be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to go to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. There they would feast and fight, preparing for Ragnarok when they would fight alongside the gods in the final battle. Even in death, they would continue to be warriors. Those who died of illness or old age would go to Hell, the realm of the dead, which was not necessarily a place of punishment, but simply a shadowy reflection of the living world. This system meant that how one died mattered enormously. This is one reason why Ragnar's death in the pit of serpents, while horrible, was also in a strange way acceptable. He died bravely, defiant to the end, and his final words ensured that his fame would live on. A cowardly death, or a death where one betrayed one's principles, would have been far worse than even the most painful death faced with courage. The Viking way of war was sophisticated and effective, built on centuries of tradition and experience. Understanding how Vikings actually fought helps us appreciate Ragnar's military achievements, whether historical or legendary, in their proper context. Viking warriors were not primarily professional soldiers, but farmers who fought when necessary. Every free man was expected to be able to defend himself and his property, and to contribute to the defense of his community. From childhood, boys were trained in the use of weapons, primarily spears, axes, and swords, supplemented by shields for defense. The spear was the most common weapon, affordable and versatile. It could be used for thrusting or throwing, was effective in formations fighting, and required less iron to make than a sword. Axes were also common, particularly among poorer warriors, as they doubled as tools for everyday work. Swords were more expensive and carried more prestige, being the weapons of wealthy warriors and professional fighters. Defensive equipment varied by wealth and status. A wealthy warrior might own a coat of mail, an iron helmet, and a substantial wooden shield reinforced with iron. A poorer warrior might have only a simple shield and perhaps a leather cap, or no head protection at all. Mail armor was extremely effective against the cutting weapons of the period, and possession of mail was a sign of significant status. Viking battles were typically brutal, face-to-face affairs. The favored formation was the shield wall, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a barrier that was difficult to break through. The front ranks would thrust with spears and chop with axes while those behind supported them, replacing wounded warriors and providing additional pushing power. Breaking the enemy's shield wall while maintaining your own was the key to victory. Individual combat also occurred, particularly when shield walls broke down, or in the fluid fighting that happened during raids. Viking warriors prized individual prowess and courage, and champions or particularly skilled fighters might issue challenges to enemy champions, with both sides standing back to watch the duel. The berserkers deserve special mention. These were warriors who reportedly entered a trance-like rage in battle, fighting with superhuman strength and apparent immunity to pain. They were said to bite their shields, howl like wild animals, and attack with such ferocity that even fellow warriors feared them. The exact nature of the berserker state has been debated. Was it a form of self-induced hysteria, the result of ingesting psychoactive substances, or simply legendary exaggeration based on the behavior of particularly aggressive warriors? We cannot know for certain, but berserkers appear regularly in saga literature and clearly represented something real, even if the reality was less dramatic than the legend. Naval warfare was equally important for the Vikings. Sea battles typically involved ships coming alongside each other, with warriors fighting from ship to ship as if they were fighting on land. The shallow draft of Viking ships meant they could be rowed into shallow water, or even pulled up onto beaches, giving raiders mobility that their opponents often could not match. The surprise raid was a favorite Viking tactic. Longships would appear suddenly, having approached via rivers or along coastlines, catching defenders unprepared. The raiders would strike swiftly, overwhelm local defenses through speed and ferocity, seize plunder and captives, and retreat to their ships before organized resistance could arrive. This hit-and-run approach minimized Viking casualties while maximizing the psychological impact on the population. Sieges were less common in Viking warfare, as the Norse generally lacked the equipment and patience for prolonged siege operations. However, they were perfectly capable of taking fortified positions through treachery, surprise, or by exploiting weaknesses in the defenses, as the story of Luna illustrates. To balance the dramatic tales of raids and battles, it's important to understand that most people in the Viking Age, even warriors like Ragnar, spent most of their time engaged in much more mundane activities. Life in a Viking Age household revolved around the agricultural calendar. Spring was for plowing and planting, summer for tending crops and livestock, autumn for harvest, and winter for indoor work and maintenance. Even wealthy jarls would have been involved in managing their estates, ensuring that food was produced and stored for the long winter months. The physical center of a wealthy Viking household was the longhouse, a substantial building that served multiple purposes. The main hall would be dominated by a long central fireplace, with raised platforms along the sides where people sat during the day and slept at night. At one end would be the high seat, where the head of household and important guests would sit. The walls might be decorated with tapestries or shields, and weapons would hang on the walls, ready for use. Meals were communal affairs. The household would gather around the fire, with people sitting in order of status. Food was served on wooden trenchers, and people ate with knives and spoons. Forks had not yet been introduced to Northern Europe. The diet would have consisted of bread, porridge, preserved meat and fish, dairy products, and whatever vegetables could be grown in the short northern growing season. Ale or mead would have been drunk with meals. Women's work was vital to the household's functioning, though it often goes unremarked in the saga's focus on male military exploits. Women were responsible for textile production, processing wool or flax, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing garments. This was time-consuming work that required considerable skill, and fine textiles were valuable trade goods. Women also typically managed the household's food stores, preserved food for winter, prepared meals, and supervised servants if the household had any. Women in Viking society had more rights and freedoms than in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, seek divorce, and manage estates when their husbands were away. Some women clearly wielded considerable power and influence, as the saga's portrayal of figures like Aslaug suggests. The extent to which the saga portrayals of strong women like Lagertha reflect historical reality remains debated, but there is evidence that some women took on roles typically reserved for men, including possibly fighting as warriors in exceptional circumstances. Children grew up quickly in Viking society. From an early age, they would help with household chores and begin learning the skills they would need as adults. Boys would learn to use weapons, sailboats, and manage farms. Girls would learn textile work, food preparation, and household management. Formal education as we understand it did not exist, though children would have absorbed knowledge through observation and practice, and through listening to the stories and poems recited in the hall. Entertainment in the long winter evenings came from storytelling, poetry, music, and games. Skalds would recite traditional poems and compose new works praising their patrons. People would play board games like Nefadaful, a strategic game somewhat similar to chess. Riddles and wordplay were popular. These gatherings around the fire, where stories were told and retold, were where the oral traditions that would eventually become the written sagas were maintained and transmitted from generation to generation. Religion permeated every aspect of Viking life, though it looked quite different from how most modern people understand religion. There were no church buildings in pagan Scandinavia, no professional clergy, and no single holy book laying out doctrine. Instead, religion was embedded in the landscape and in daily practice. Sacred places were often natural features, particular groves of trees, unusual rock formations, springs, or waterfalls. These were places where the barrier between the human world and the world of the gods or spirits was thought to be thin, where offerings could be made and where one might receive omens or visions. Sacrifices were a central part of Norse religious practice. Animals, and in some cases humans, though probably rarely, might be offered to the gods. The sacrifice of horses was particularly important, as horses were valuable, and their sacrifice represented a significant gift to the gods. The flesh of sacrificed animals would typically be eaten in a ritual feast, creating a sense of communion between the human participants and the divine recipients of the sacrifice. Different gods were appropriate for different purposes. Thor, the thunder god, was probably the most widely worshipped, as he was seen as the protector of ordinary people and the maintainer of order. Farmers might sacrifice to Thor for protection and good harvests. Freyr, the god of fertility, would be honored for the same reasons. Odin was more ambiguous. He was the Allfather, the greatest of the gods, but also the god of war and death, of cunning and poetry. Warriors and chieftains particularly honored him, hoping for his favor in battle, but everyone knew that Odin was unpredictable and that his favor might be withdrawn as easily as it was given. The Volva, or Side Kona, a female practitioner of cider, a form of Norse magic, held an important place in society. These women were believed capable of seeing the future, communicating with spirits, and influencing fate through their rituals. When important decisions needed to be made, a Volva might be consulted. The sagas sometimes portray Aslaug as having cider abilities, which would have made her a powerful and perhaps somewhat feared figure. Magic in the Norse world was not clearly separated from religion, and both were integrated into what we would call practical life. Runes, the angular letters used for writing, were believed to have magical properties when properly used. Carving the right runes on a weapon might make it more effective. On an amulet, they might provide protection. In a curse, they might bring harm to an enemy. Fate, or wired, was a complex concept in Norse belief. It was not quite predetermination. Actions had consequences and choices mattered, but there was also a sense that certain events were fated to happen, that the pattern of one's life was woven by the Norns, the three female beings who determined destiny. A person could face their fate with courage or cowardice, could try to work with it or against it, but ultimately, what was fated would come to pass. This perhaps explains Ragnar's apparent acceptance of his death. In the saga, when facing his fate in the pit of serpents, he does not rail against the injustice of it or beg for his life. He accepts that this is his weird, and he faces it as a warrior should, with courage and defiance. In doing so, he transforms what could have been a shameful death into one that enhances his legend. Central to understanding Ragnar and the Viking worldview is the concept of honor, though this English word is somewhat inadequate to capture what the Norse meant. The Old Norse concept of virding, or samd, is closer to what we might call reputation or social standing. But even these terms don't fully capture it. In Norse society, your reputation was, in many ways, more important than your life. This was a culture that believed firmly in life after death. But the afterlife was not seen as the main point of existence. What mattered was how you were remembered by the living, the stories that would be told about you around fires and in halls after you were gone. This created a powerful incentive system. A person who wanted to be remembered would need to do memorable things, achieve great victories, show extraordinary courage, give generous gifts, compose poetry, or in some other way, make a mark that would outlast their physical existence. The worst fate was not death, but to be forgotten, to pass through life without leaving any trace. Honor was maintained through fulfilling obligations and through response to insults or attacks. If someone harmed you or insulted you and you did nothing about it, you lost honor. The appropriate response might be legal action. Norse society had sophisticated legal systems and valued law highly, but it might also be violence. The feud, where harm was repaid with harm in an escalating cycle of violence, was a persistent feature of Nordic life and a major theme in the sagas. This system created both stability and instability. On the one hand, the obligation to respond to insults meant that people were careful not to give offense unnecessarily. The emphasis on oaths and promises meant that agreements had weight, because breaking them would result in loss of reputation. On the other hand, the system could lead to cycles of violence that devastated families and communities, as each act of revenge sparked another in an endless chain. The legal systems that developed in Viking Age Scandinavia were attempts to manage and channel this honor-based culture in less destructive directions. Rather than requiring blood vengeance for every wrong, the law courts could assess compensation that the wrong party would accept in lieu of revenge. A man who killed another might be required to pay gild, literally man payment, to the victim's family, the amount determined by the victim's social status. But legal remedies only worked if both parties accepted them. A person who felt their honor demanded blood revenge might reject compensation and pursue the feud anyway. And some wrongs were considered so severe that only blood could satisfy them. The murder of a close family member, for instance, or the violation of hospitality. This helps explain why Ragnar's sons could not simply accept compensation for their father's death. Ragnar was not just murdered. He was killed in a deliberately humiliating manner by King Aila. No amount of silver could compensate for that. And for the sons to accept payment and do nothing else would have been to lose honor themselves. They had to pursue revenge, not just because they loved their father, though presumably they did, but because their own reputations demanded it. The sagas are one of medieval Iceland's greatest contributions to world literature, and understanding something about how they were created and what purposes they served helps us better understand the story of Ragnar Lodbrok. Iceland was settled primarily in the late 9th and early 10th centuries by immigrants from Norway, many of whom were fleeing the increasing centralization of power under King Harald Fairhair. They brought with them the oral traditions of mainland Scandinavia, stories, poems, and historical memories that were passed down from generation to generation. For about 200 years, these traditions remained oral. People memorized stories and poems, and skilled reciters could hold audiences spellbound with their performances. The accuracy of oral transmission can be remarkable. There are cultures where oral historians can recite genealogies and events going back many generations with impressive accuracy. But oral traditions also inevitably change over time. Details are forgotten, dramatic elements are emphasized, stories merge together, and the line between history and legend becomes blurred. In the 12th and 13th centuries, something remarkable happened in Iceland. The Christian monasteries had brought literacy to the island, but unlike in most of medieval Europe, where literacy was used almost exclusively for religious purposes, Icelanders began using alphabetic writing to record their traditional stories and histories. The result was the sagas. Saga is simply the Old Norse word for story, and the saga literature is remarkably diverse, including the Íslendingasögur, sagas of Icelanders, which tell stories about the settlement period and the generations that followed, the Fornaldarsögur, legendary sagas, which deal with ancient times and often include fantastical elements, the Konungasögur, which chronicle the lives of Norwegian kings, various other categories including sagas of bishops, contemporary sagas, and chivalric sagas. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok falls into the Fornaldarsögur category. These sagas deal with heroes from the distant past, before the settlement of Iceland, and they typically include more supernatural and legendary elements than the sagas of Icelanders, which generally attempt to maintain a more realistic tone. The saga writers were not writing history in the modern sense. They were creating literature, stories meant to entertain, instruct, and preserve cultural memory. They felt free to invent dialogue, to structure events for dramatic effect, and to include legendary elements. But they were also working with inherited traditions and genuinely believed, in most cases, that they were recording real events, even if those events had been transformed by the passage of time. This creates the challenge modern readers face with sagas. How do we extract historical reality from literary creation? There is no simple answer. Each saga, and indeed each episode within a saga, must be evaluated individually. Some elements have strong support from other sources and are probably historical. Others are clearly legendary or fictional, and many fall somewhere in between, containing a core of truth elaborated with literary invention. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok was probably written in Iceland in the early 13th century, though the surviving manuscripts are later copies. The author is anonymous, as is the case with most saga literature. The saga draws on earlier poetic sources, including the death song of Ragnar Lodbrok, which may be somewhat older than the prose saga, though determining the precise age of Old Norse poems is notoriously difficult. The saga was part of a larger cycle dealing with Ragnar and his sons, including the saga of the sons of Ragnar and the tale of Ragnar's sons. These related works expand on episodes mentioned briefly in the main saga and continue the story beyond Ragnar's death to deal more extensively with his son's exploits. The death song deserves special attention, as it is perhaps the most famous piece of Old Norse poetry associated with Ragnar. Whether it was actually composed by a dying Ragnar, or was written much later and attributed to him, or falls somewhere in between, it remains a powerful piece of literature that encapsulates the Viking worldview. The poem is 29 stanzas long, and it follows a repeating structure. Each stanza typically begins with Hjogum ver med Jorvi, we struck with swords, or variations thereof, followed by a description of a battle or raid, and ends with a refrain that changes as the poem progresses, reflecting Ragnar's acceptance of death and confidence in his reputation. The battles described in the death song take the listener on a tour of Ragnar's supposed conquests. He speaks of fighting in various locations, of defeating enemies, of winning treasure and glory. Some of these references may be to actual events, others are probably legendary, and some may be so obscure that modern readers cannot identify what they refer to at all. As the poem progresses, Ragnar's attention shifts from past glories to his present situation and his coming death. He begins to speak directly about dying, about the nature of fate, and about what awaits him. There is no self-pity in these stanzas, but rather a kind of fierce joy. Ragnar has lived as a warrior should, has won fame that will last, and now death comes as a fitting end to a well-lived life. The final stanzas are the most famous. Ragnar speaks of the young pigs grunting, his prophecy about his son's revenge. He expresses his eagerness to join the Einherjar, the heroic dead in Valhalla, where he will feast and fight. And then the poem ends with Ragnar's declaration of readiness. Laughing shall I die. This ending is striking in multiple ways. The laughter is defiance. Ragnar refuses to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him despair. It is also confidence. He knows his reputation is secure and that he goes to a glorious afterlife. And it may also be a kind of grim humor, a recognition of the absurdity and inevitability of death that the truly courageous can laugh at even as it takes them. The death song has inspired countless later works. It has been translated into numerous languages, adapted into modern poems and songs, and its themes and images have influenced literature across centuries. Its vision of the hero facing death with courage and even joy, secure in the knowledge that his deeds will live on after him, struck a chord that resonated far beyond Viking Age Scandinavia. Moving away from literary sources, what can archaeology tell us about the Viking Age and the world of Ragnar Lodbrok? Quite a bit, actually, even if it cannot definitively prove or disprove Ragnar's existence. Burial practices in the Viking Age varied depending on region, time period, and social status, but they provide our richest source of information about the material culture of the period. High-status burials are particularly informative, as they often contain grave goods, objects buried with the deceased to accompany them to the afterlife. The most spectacular Viking burial discovered is probably the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, found in 1904. This burial, dated to 834 CE, contained a well-preserved longship, along with the remains of 2 women and an extraordinary array of grave goods, intricately carved wooden objects, textiles, a wagon, sleds, and much more. The craftsmanship evident in these objects demonstrates the high level of artistic achievement in Viking Age Scandinavia. While the Oseberg burial is exceptional in its preservation and richness, it represents one end of a spectrum of burial practices. Some high-status individuals were buried in ships, either full-sized vessels or smaller boats. Others were placed in boat-shaped stone settings. Some were cremated, others inhumed. The variation reflects both regional differences and changing practices over the Viking Age's 300-year span. Weapons and burials tell us about the importance of martial identity in Viking culture. A sword buried with a warrior was often his most prized possession, sometimes bearing names and believed to have power of its own. The quality and quantity of weapons in a burial can indicate the deceased's status. A wealthy warrior might be buried with sword, spear, axes, shield, and armor, while a poorer one might have only a single spear or axe. Settlements and fortifications provide another line of evidence. The remains of Viking Age farmsteads, villages, and trading centers have been excavated throughout Scandinavia and in Viking settlements abroad. These show patterns of daily life, agricultural practices, trade networks, and social organization. The trading towns are particularly interesting. Places like Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Kaupang in Norway were cosmopolitan centers where goods from across the known world could be found. Archaeological excavations have uncovered Arabic silver coins, glass beads from the Mediterranean, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from the Arctic, and much more. These finds demonstrate the extent of Viking trade networks and the sophisticated commercial activities they engaged in. Fortifications like the Trelleborg in Denmark show the organizational capacity of Viking Age societies. These ring forts, precisely geometrically designed, required significant resources and centralized authority to construct. They suggest a level of political organization greater than the typical picture of independent chieftains might indicate. DNA analysis is a relatively new tool in Viking Age studies, but it has already produced interesting results. Analysis of skeletal remains can reveal family relationships, migration patterns, and even sometimes details about health and diet. As the database of analyzed Viking Age remains grows, and as analytical techniques improve, DNA evidence may help answer questions about historical individuals and events that have remained mysteries. One particularly interesting recent finding has been the identification of what may have been a female warrior in a high-status grave at Birka. The burial, previously assumed to be male based on its grave goods, which included weapons and gaming pieces suggesting a military commander, was revealed through DNA analysis to actually contain a female body. This has sparked considerable debate about the role of women in Viking warfare and society, and about how we interpret archaeological evidence. One of the most important long-term consequences of the Viking Age was the establishment of the Normans in France, and while this is not directly part of Ragnar's story, it deserves mention as part of the broader context of Viking expansion and its consequences. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo, possibly the same person mentioned in some sources as a son or associate of Ragnar, though the connections are very unclear, was granted lands in northern France by King Charles the Simple. This grant came after decades of Viking raids on Francia, and Charles's deal with Rollo was essentially a recognition of reality. The Vikings controlled this territory anyway, so better to have them as nominal vassals who might help defend against other Viking raiders. Rollo and his followers settled in what became known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. Over the following generations, these Vikings adopted French language and customs, intermarried with the local population, converted to Christianity, and became French in culture while retaining elements of their Scandinavian heritage. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of those Viking settlers, invaded and conquered England. The Norman conquest was one of the most significant events in English history, fundamentally reshaping English society, language, law, and culture. The irony is striking. The Anglo-Saxons had fought for centuries against Viking invaders, had finally established stable kingdoms, and then were conquered by the descendants of Vikings who had become Frenchified. This demonstrates a pattern that was repeated across Viking expansion. Initially, Vikings came as raiders. Then they came as settlers. Finally, they integrated with local populations, creating hybrid cultures that combine Norse and local elements. The process took generations, but its effects were profound and lasting. The Viking Age ended around 1066, with Harald Hardrada's defeat at Stamford Bridge, often cited as the symbolic endpoint. But the cultural legacy of the Vikings, and of figures like Ragnar Lodbrok, has persisted and continues to the present day. In Scandinavia itself, the Viking Age came to be seen as a formative period in national histories. In the 19th century, when Romantic nationalism was sweeping across Europe, Vikings were embraced as symbols of Nordic identity. The fierce independent warriors of the sagas became models of national character, and Viking imagery was incorporated into everything from political rhetoric to artistic design. This romanticized vision of the Vikings, however, was selective and often problematic. It emphasized martial valor and exploration, while downplaying less palatable aspects of Viking culture, like slavery, violence, and the raids that devastated countless communities. The Nazi regime in Germany particularly misappropriated Viking symbols and Norse mythology, associating them with racist ideologies that would have been foreign to the historical Vikings and that have no place in legitimate historical study. Modern scholarship has worked to develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the Viking Age, recognizing both the genuine achievements of Norse culture and the genuine harm caused by Viking raids and conquests. Vikings were neither the savage barbarians that some medieval chronicles portrayed, nor the noble warriors that Romantic nationalism imagined, but complex people living in complex times. In popular culture, Vikings have experienced something of a renaissance in recent decades. Television series, novels, video games, and films have brought Viking Age settings and stories to mass audiences. Ragnar Lodbrok himself became the protagonist of the History Channel's Viking series, which, while taking considerable creative liberties with history and saga material, introduced his story to millions of viewers worldwide. This popular culture interest has both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it has generated broader public interest in Viking history and medieval Scandinavia, leading more people to explore the actual historical and archaeological evidence. On the negative side, these popular portrayals often perpetuate myths and inaccuracies, and casual viewers may not distinguish between dramatic invention and historical reality. As we approach the end of our journey through Ragnar's life and legend, it is worth pondering what it all means. Why does this story, in all its variations and uncertainties, continue to resonate over 1,000 years after the events it describes, or doesn't, describe supposedly occurred? Part of the answer lies in the universal themes the story touches on. Ragnar's tale is about ambition and achievement, about father-son relationships, about love and loss, about facing mortality with courage. These are themes that transcend any particular culture or time period. Whether Ragnar actually lived or not, the story constructed around his name speaks to fundamental human experiences and aspirations. The story also exemplifies the tragic hero archetype. Ragnar rises from relatively modest beginnings, or from royal birth, depending on the version, to achieve great things. He wins victories, amasses wealth, fathers remarkable sons, and becomes famous throughout the known world. But his very success contains the seeds of his downfall. His pride, his restlessness, his desire for one more adventure leads him to England with insufficient forces, and that leads to his death. Yet, even in death, Ragnar triumphs in a way. His death is not the end of his story, but its culmination. His final words set in motion the revenge of his sons, which leads to the conquest of much of England and the establishment of Viking kingdoms that would last for generations. His prophecy is fulfilled, and his fame is secured. From a saga perspective, this is a good death, a meaningful death that enhances rather than diminishes the hero's reputation. There is also something appealing about the ambiguity of Ragnar's existence. In an age where we expect definitive answers, where we can look up almost anything on our phones and get immediate information, Ragnar remains a mystery. We cannot prove he existed, but we cannot prove he didn't. He exists in that liminal space between history and legend, real and imaginary, and perhaps that is exactly where he belongs. The sagas themselves seem to acknowledge this liminality. They present their stories as history, but they include elements: talking ravens, prophetic dreams, magical rings, improbable feats of strength that push beyond the realistic. The saga writers, even while believing in the essential truth of their stories, understood that they were dealing with a heroic past, a time when things were larger and more dramatic than in their own mundane present. What does it mean to be a hero? This question is implicit throughout the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok. Different cultures and eras have had different answers, and the Viking conception of heroism is particularly interesting because it differs in some important ways from modern ideas. For the Vikings, a hero was defined primarily by actions and outcomes, not by internal qualities or motivations. It was not particularly important whether Ragnar was a good person in any moral sense. What mattered was whether he was courageous, whether he was successful, whether he was generous to his followers, whether he fulfilled his obligations, and whether he faced his fate with dignity. This amoral, not immoral, but operating according to a different moral framework, conception of heroism can be challenging for modern readers. We want our heroes to be good people who do good things. We want clear moral guidance from our stories. The sagas, however, refuse to provide simple moral lessons. Their heroes are complex, often contradictory figures who do both admirable and questionable things. Ragnar kills many people in his raids. From the perspective of his victims, he is a terror, a bringer of death and destruction. The saga does not dwell on this or present it as problematic. From the saga's perspective, this is simply what warriors do. What matters is that Ragnar is good at it, that he is strategic and successful, that he takes care of his people, and that he becomes famous. This perspective was not unique to Vikings. Most warrior cultures throughout history have celebrated military prowess and conquest, even when that meant great suffering for those on the losing end. What is perhaps distinctive about the Norse is their particular emphasis on fame and reputation as the primary measure of a person's worth. Legacy, then, becomes central. What will people say about you after you're gone? Will your name be remembered, and if so, for what? This is why Ragnar's death song is so focused on recounting his achievements. He is constructing his own legacy in his final moments, ensuring that those who hear the song will remember him as he wishes to be remembered. In our own time, we might ask similar questions with different specifics. What will your legacy be? How will you be remembered? What actions are you taking now that will matter in the long term? The context changes, but the fundamental human concern with leaving something meaningful behind remains. After the conquest of England and the death of their father's killer, the sons of Ragnar pursued different paths. Their stories, which extend beyond the scope of the main Ragnar saga, show the diversity of possibilities available to successful Viking leaders in the late 9th century. Ivar, as we noted earlier, became king in Dublin and died there, leaving a reputation as one of the most formidable strategists of his age. His legacy in Ireland was significant, and Norse-Irish dynasties that may have been his descendants ruled in Dublin and elsewhere for centuries. Bjorn Ironside reportedly returned to Scandinavia after his Mediterranean adventures and ruled as king in Sweden. Some Swedish royal genealogies claim descent from him, though whether these claims are historically accurate is uncertain. The fact that later kings wanted to claim descent from Bjorn suggests that his reputation remained powerful long after his death. Hvitserk's fate is unclear and varies in different sources. Some accounts have him continuing to campaign in England and Ireland. Others place him in continental Europe. The uncertainty surrounding his later life may indicate that he was less prominent than his brothers, or it may simply reflect the confusion and conflation of sources. Sigurd's snake in the eye is said to have remained in Denmark, possibly ruling there after his father. Like his brothers, later Danish royal houses claim descent from him, though the reliability of these genealogies is questionable. The great heathen army itself eventually fragmented. Some of its members settled in the territories they had conquered, becoming farmers and traders in the Danelaw. Others continued to fight, joining new expeditions or pursuing their own goals. Still others returned to Scandinavia with their wealth and fame, becoming influential there. The period following the Great Heathen Army's campaigns saw the establishment of Norse kingdoms and settlements throughout the British Isles and beyond. These settlers and their descendants would play crucial roles in British and Irish history for centuries. They would intermarry with locals, adopt Christianity while retaining elements of Norse culture, and create hybrid societies that were neither purely Norse nor purely Anglo-Saxon or Celtic. The religious transformation of Scandinavia was one of the most significant changes of the late Viking Age, and it fundamentally altered the culture that had produced heroes like Ragnar. Christianity had been present at the margins of Scandinavia since late Roman times, but significant conversion only began in the 9th and 10th centuries. Missionaries, often from England or Germany, ventured north to preach to the pagans. Some were martyred, others gained converts, and gradually Christianity established footholds in the Norse world. The conversion was not a simple replacement of one religion with another, but a complex, multi-generational process with many reversals and compromises. Kings and jarls who converted often did so for political reasons. Christianity could legitimize their rule in Christian Europe, facilitate trade, and provide access to Christian literacy and administrative systems. But their subjects might remain pagan or might adopt a syncretic religion that combined elements of both faiths. There are many stories of this transitional period. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark is credited with converting Denmark to Christianity in the 960s, and he had a famous runestone erected to commemorate his achievement. The stone declares that Harald made the Danes Christian, though the reality was surely more gradual and contested than this proclamation suggests. In Norway, conversion was pushed by kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, who used both persuasion and violence to spread Christianity. They destroyed pagan temples, killed or exiled those who refused conversion, and brought priests from abroad to establish the new religion. Iceland converted officially around 1000 CE, though the process was remarkably peaceful compared to Norway. At the Althing, Iceland's assembly, after much debate, it was decided that Iceland would officially be Christian, though private pagan practice would still be permitted. This pragmatic compromise allowed for social unity while acknowledging the genuine religious diversity that still existed. Sweden was the last of the major Scandinavian realms to convert, with Christianity not becoming fully established until the 11th or early 12th century. The famous temple at Uppsala, described in various sources as a major center of pagan worship, supposedly stood until around 1100 before being replaced with a Christian church. What did conversion mean for the culture that had produced the sagas? It meant the end of practices like human sacrifice and pagan burial customs. It meant the introduction of literacy on a wider scale, as monasteries and churches became centers of learning. It meant connection to the broader European world and its political, economic, and cultural networks. But conversion also meant loss. The rich mythology and worldview of Norse paganism were officially rejected. The gods who had been honored for centuries were declared false. The values that had animated Viking culture, the emphasis on individual glory, the acceptance of violence, the this-worldly focus, were challenged by Christian emphasis on humility, peace, and the afterlife. The sagas themselves are products of this transitional period. They were written by Christians about pagans. They look back with a kind of nostalgia to the heroic age of their ancestors, even while implicitly acknowledging that that age is past. The saga writers clearly admire their pagan heroes, but they also sometimes seem to judge them or find their world lacking when measured against Christian standards. One of the fascinating aspects of the Ragnar legend is how it keeps returning, being rediscovered and reimagined by new generations. Each age finds something different in the story, interprets it according to its own values and concerns, and creates new versions that speak to contemporary audiences. In the medieval period, the saga was entertainment and cultural memory, a way of connecting to the heroic past and preserving stories that people believed, in some sense, to be true. The saga was copied and recopied by medieval scribes, each copy potentially introducing small changes, so that we have multiple versions that differ in details. In the early modern period, interest in Old Norse literature waned. The texts were still being copied in Iceland, but they were little known outside that island. This began to change in the 17th and 18th centuries as antiquarians and scholars became interested in medieval manuscripts. Old Norse texts began to be translated into Latin and modern languages, making them accessible to European scholars. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in Viking Age material, driven by romantic nationalism. Ragnar's saga was translated into numerous languages. Poets wrote new versions of his story. Artists created dramatic paintings depicting scenes from his life. The death song was particularly popular, being translated and adapted by poets across Europe. In the 20th century, Ragnar appeared in various forms, in historical novels, in scholarly studies, in popular histories. Each work reflected the concerns and style of its time. Some emphasized the adventure and romance, others tried to extract historical facts from legendary elaboration. Still others analyzed the saga as literature, or as a window into Viking Age mentality. And in the 21st century, as we've noted, Ragnar has become a media phenomenon, appearing in television series, video games, graphic novels, and other forms. The Vikings TV series, despite its many departures from saga and history, introduced Ragnar Lodbrok to a global audience of millions and sparked renewed interest in Viking Age studies. This eternal return, the way each age rediscovers and reinvents Ragnar, suggests that there is something fundamentally compelling about the story. Whether it is the universal themes it explores, the dramatic nature of the events, the ambiguity of what is real and what is legendary, or simply the powerful figure of Ragnar himself, the story continues to resonate. We must acknowledge that in spending so much time with Ragnar's story, we have been dealing with something that exists in a peculiar space between truth and fiction. This is not history in the modern sense, with documented evidence and peer-reviewed analysis. But neither is it pure fiction, invented from whole cloth with no connection to reality. Legend occupies a middle ground. It begins with something real events, real people, real places, and then grows through retelling. Each telling adds something, emphasizes certain aspects while downplaying others, makes the story more dramatic or more meaningful or simply more entertaining. Over generations, the original reality becomes so overlaid with elaboration that separating the two becomes impossible. But perhaps separation is not the point. Perhaps what legends offer us is not factual accuracy, but a different kind of truth. Truth about values, about what a culture considers worth remembering, about how people make sense of their world and their experiences. The legend of Ragnar Lodbrok tells us that Viking Age Scandinavians valued courage, cunning, loyalty to family, and fame that outlasted death. It tells us that they saw life as a struggle against fate, a struggle that might ultimately be futile, but that could be faced with defiance and joy. It tells us that they believed actions mattered more than intentions, that how you faced death was as important as how you lived, and that being remembered was a kind of immortality. These are the truths embedded in the legend, regardless of whether Ragnar himself really lived or what the exact details of his life might have been. The saga preserves a worldview, a set of values, a way of understanding existence. In that sense, it is profoundly true, even if it is not factual. Modern historians sometimes express frustration with legendary material. It cannot be used as straightforward evidence for events. It requires careful, skeptical analysis, and even then often yields more questions than answers. But legend has its own value, and the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok is valuable not despite its legendary nature, but in some ways because of it. As our journey through the life of Ragnar Lodbrok draws to a close, we find ourselves back where we began, with mystery and ambiguity. Did Ragnar exist? Probably some version of him did, though not exactly as the sagas describe. Was he the heroic figure of legend? In some ways, perhaps yes. In others, certainly no. And in many ways the question is unanswerable because the evidence is simply insufficient. But in another sense, Ragnar definitely exists. He exists in the stories that have been told about him for over 1,000 years. He exists in the cultural memory of Scandinavia and in the broader Western imagination. He exists as a symbol and a character, as an embodiment of certain values and aspirations. The Ragnar of legend is larger than life, more cunning, more brave, more successful than any real person could be. He is a composite of multiple people's achievements, a crystallization of Viking Age ideals, a character shaped by centuries of retelling to embody what the culture valued most. But underneath the legend, we can glimpse something more human. The story of Ragnar and Thora speaks to real love and real loss. The relationship between Ragnar and his sons reflects genuine bonds of family. The death song, whether actually composed by a dying warrior or written later, captures something authentic about how people face mortality and think about legacy. In the end, perhaps the distinction between the historical Ragnar and the legendary Ragnar matters less than we might initially think. What we have is a story, and stories have their own reality. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok has shaped how people think about the Viking Age, has inspired countless works of art and literature, and has provided generations of people with a compelling narrative about courage, ambition, and the desire to be remembered. The legend continues to evolve. New archaeological discoveries might shed light on the historical context. New scholarly analysis might reveal aspects of the sagas we haven't previously recognized. New creative works will continue to adapt and reimagine the story for contemporary audiences. Ragnar's saga is not a finished text, but a living tradition, still growing and changing as it always has. For those of us who encounter Ragnar today, whether through the sagas, through historical study, or through modern adaptations, he offers something valuable, a glimpse into a different time and culture, a story that explores timeless themes, and a reminder that the desire to live meaningfully and be remembered has been with humanity for as long as we have been telling stories. And so, we come to the end of our calm journey through the life and legend of Ragnar Lodbrok. We have traveled from the fjords of Scandinavia to the walls of Paris, from the great halls of Denmark to the pit of serpents in Northumbria. We have explored battles and raids, love and loss, triumph and defeat. We have seen how one man, or perhaps the idea of one man, could embody the values and aspirations of an entire culture. We have grappled with the challenges of distinguishing history from legend, and considered why that distinction, while important to historians, might be less important than the power of the story itself. Ragnar Lodbrok, whether he walked this earth exactly as described or not, represents something important about the human experience. He represents the desire to achieve great things, to overcome obstacles, to be remembered after death. He represents courage in the face of danger, cunning in the face of challenges, and defiance in the face of mortality. His story reminds us that fame and reputation were, for the Vikings, not shallow concerns, but deep existential needs. When you believe that death is inevitable and absolute, that there is no eternal heaven waiting for you, then being remembered becomes critically important. It is the only immortality truly available. But the story also reminds us of the costs of such a life. Ragnar's pursuit of glory took him away from home and family. His ambition led him into danger that eventually killed him. His very success may have bred the restlessness that led to his downfall. The heroic life, the saga suggests, is glorious but also tragic. As you prepare for sleep, perhaps you can take something from Ragnar's story. Not necessarily the specifics of his actions. Most of us are not called upon to raid cities or lead armies, but perhaps something about facing challenges with courage, about valuing loyalty and family, about making your actions count and living in such a way that you will be remembered fondly by those who come after. The Vikings believed that the dead lived on in the memories of the living. Ragnar Lodbrok, whether historical figure or legendary creation, has lived on for over a millennium in the stories we tell. His name is still spoken, his deeds still recounted, his death song still read and admired. In that sense, Ragnar achieved what he sought, fame that outlasted death, a name that continues to be remembered. The young pigs did grunt as he predicted. His sons took their revenge and became legends in their own right, and the old boar's story lived on, growing and changing through the centuries, but never forgotten. Rest now, and perhaps dream of longships cutting through northern seas, of warriors in mead halls, of skalds singing of great deeds, of a time when the world was younger and larger and more filled with possibility. Dream of heroes and gods, of courage and fate, of the endless human quest for meaning and remembrance. And when you wake, remember that you too are creating a story, that your actions and choices are weaving a narrative that will be your legacy. Live, as Ragnar tried to do, in such a way that your story is worth remembering. Laughing shall I die, he said, and perhaps there is wisdom in that, in facing even the darkest moments with courage and humor, in accepting fate while also defying it, in finding joy even in the face of death. The saga ends, but the legend lives on. And now, as the story concludes and sleep beckons, we too become part of that great chain of listeners and tellers, those who have heard the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok and passed it on to others. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may your own saga be worth telling.